It's Ashleigh from Sweet Dreams Bake Shop, and today I'm going to show you my take on the Little Mermaid. Now, there's lots of different ways to do this. If you want to make it look more like the actual movie character, you can do that as well, but I'm going to go the more simplistic route, and I will often do this with different characters, especially if it's for my children's cakes. Then I like to put my own little spin on it to make it look more like my own, but still give the idea of that character. So I'm starting off with a 6-inch cake, and this is just a cake from one pan. I'm not going to cut this in half or anything, but you definitely could to add more filling in there, and then you could start carving your cakes. Then to make the hair portion, I'm actually going to take some Rice Krispie treats and do it this way. You can also do this with cake too. I just didn't have enough cake on hand. I'll often do projects like this if I only have one cake pan left or just some leftover cake that I want to do something fun with. Then I'm going to cover it all generously with some Italian meringue buttercream. Now you'll notice that I didn't carve out any other details, really just the eyes and adding on that nose and the hair. The reason is because we can add in all of those other details after this process. Now don't be too worried about the crumb coating process. If it's not perfect, that's totally fine, because I'm going to show you a technique to smooth everything out. The most important thing here is just making sure that you don't fill up those eye sockets completely, because you will need that space in order for the eyes to sit inlay. While that sits in the fridge so it can harden up just a little bit, I am preparing my fondant, and I'm doing it in the worst way possible using gel food coloring. Now, this doesn't mean it doesn't work. It's just super messy whenever I do it this way. I would prefer Fondant. If you guys saw my organization video, I'm very low on my selection of Fondant. Fondant is a great coloring system for your fondants. It's a lot less messy. All right, so after that sat in the fridge for a little bit, I am going to give this a second crumb coat. Now, if you manage to crumb coat your cake really well the first time, you honestly don't have to do this. I felt like mine was a little bit thin, so I'm just going to add a little bit more. I often get questions from you guys about what type of buttercreams work underneath fondant. A lot of them will. I prefer Italian meringue buttercream or American buttercream, or if you're getting fancy, then ganache works great as well. Just make sure that your ratio is correct. Now for the color of her face, I did add just a little bit of peach and a little bit of brown. And honestly, I was very sparing with it. Maybe even a little bit too sparing. Could have gone up a shade darker and maybe slightly less pink, but it's all good. Now you'll notice that I'm smoothing everything out with my hands. I'm not using anything on there. With Italian meringue buttercream, it does tend to smooth out really easily. Just getting everything nice and smooth so we don't see any of those lines underneath the fondant. And for reference, I am using Satin Ice fondant today. I absolutely love this fondant. It's my favorite fondant, my go-to fondant that I purchase in bulk. Some of you guys mentioned some tearing happening with your Satin Ice. Highly recommend that you add shortening to it, just a little bit if you are experiencing tearing. Now, once you get all of those details that are on nice and firmly, you want to make sure that you cut off all the excess. And I do say firmly so that everything is actually adhered to your cake. You don't want anything coming off. If you're using American buttercream underneath, you will need to add a little bit of shortening, or you can steam your cake if you'd prefer not to use shortening. And I must apologize, guys. My hands stay pink for the rest of the video. That's what happens when you dye with food gel and you don't have gloves. When I first started making carved cakes, I would call this kind of a semi-carved cake because it's not something that's really going to be difficult with stability. But one of the things that I struggled with was making sure that all of the pieces were cut off. And I found that my fondant would stick to parts that I didn't want it to stick to. That just means it needs to spend a little bit more time in the refrigerator. As you can see, I laid all of those pieces a little bit more inlay, and I wasn't afraid to continue to work with that fondant. Once that fondant is placed on, go ahead, keep working with it. Now for this hair, in order to reduce the amount of fondant that I was using, I did place the head down first and then place the red fondant all around it. And I did make kind of like snake-like structures all around her hair just to give it some extra pop, and I used a texturization tool. Now to make her eyes really pop, I'm just taking some black fondant, which I rolled, and then adding those pieces on with a little bit of water to adhere everything together. And now I'm just making this little seashell bow using a seashell mold, the mold that I got from my giant haul. And notice I am just kind of creating a little bit more deeper of a texture there with that tool. Don't be afraid to do that. Do whatever you think looks best for your Ariel. I must apologize in advance, guys. I lose part of my painting here. I think I thought I was pressing record, but in fact, it was not recording. But basically, I'm just taking my gel food colorings and mixing it with a little bit of vodka. Often, if I have the airbrush color, I will use that instead, so that way I don't have to mix anything with vodka. I can just paint with it directly. But there's also a large number of edible painting products out there that you can use as well. So all I'm doing here is I'm creating a really, really large iris, and I do that on both sides. If you want to lighten it up a little bit, add a little bit more vodka or add some white food coloring. And then I, skipped a bunch of different things, but basically what I did was I added on those black pupils, and I also put a little bit of white food coloring in that left-hand corner of the eye as well. And all I'm doing here is brushing off a little bit of the excess cornstarch, but we are going to steam this later. Now, I make another mistake here, classic me. It's a little bit wet on the surface of my aerial, which I didn't notice. So when I'm dusting on these luster dusts and these petal dusts, it kind of gets a little bit gucky. So don't do that. Make sure that it's fully dry when you're going to brush these on, which is her little bit of eyeshadow, I suppose. Or you can also skip this step too if you don't want to add any petal or luster dusts. I went a little bit more heavy-handed on her cheek area just to make her look extra cute. And now I'm going to use a pearl for her eye glint. Now, the reason that I use this as opposed to anything else is for expediency. I don't want to have to wait for that black underneath to dry completely. And if I don't, then when I put on white food coloring, I find it gets kind of mixed. So I like to use some sort of edible pearl, or you can also just use a ball of fondant too. But I find that the edible pearl is the exact right size as is, so I prefer to use that. And now I'm blending out her blush just a smidge. Then we want to give our cake a good steam because we're going to add in all of those little details. I actually switched up the structure of her hair a little bit and got rid of that gap in between. Instead, I decided to add more shells and more edible pearls there to give it more balance. Do make sure that you don't steam it after you've applied all of those sixlets and pearls, or else you will ruin the surface of those pearls. They will no longer be shiny and they'll become matte. What I love about this style of cake is that it's so easy to transport, but you still get that character feeling across. Now let's get into the pricing of this cake. Now, even though this is a flat cake, not a whole lot of structure involved with this, I would still price this at $200 Canadian. There's a lot of fondant work involved in this, and there's also several different colors and mediums used. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you can be part of the Sweetie fam. Right now, I'm uploading weekly, so make sure you hit that notification bell so you know when I upload. Also, be sure to comment, request, or ask a question. I love hearing from you guys. Bye!